The sky over New York didn't crack or burn when Beerus arrived. It simply went quiet. Sound faded first, like the city had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. Then gravity bent just enough for people to stumble, drop to their knees, or look up in confusion as a purple figure hovered above the skyline, unimpressed. Homelander was already in the air, responding out of instinct, cape snapping as cameras turned toward him. He smiled the way he always did, confident, rehearsed, ready to remind the world who protected it. Beerus didn't look at him. He flicked a finger instead, and a Vought Tower subsidiary vanished, gone without fire, without debris, erased like it had never been approved to exist. Panic spread faster than explosions ever could. Phones died mid-recording. Subs froze, suddenly aware that strength meant nothing without permission. Homelander felt it then, the pressure of something absolute brushing past his ego like it wasn't there at all. Beerus finally spoke, voice calm, bored, and lethal. "This universe," he said, "is noisy." And for the first time, Earth realized judgment had arrived without asking consent. What happens when a false god is evaluated by a real one? If absolute power appeared tomorrow and found your world disappointing, would you beg, submit, or try to impress it? Stay with the story, weigh that choice carefully, and consider subscribing to witness what judgment looks like when mercy is optional. Beerus did not arrive in a flash of light or a cosmic explosion. There was no warning tremor, no celestial fanfare, nothing dramatic enough for the people below to understand what was happening. One moment the sky above New York was full of helicopters, drones, and news choppers circling a routine Vought press event. The next, every engine in the air stalled at the same time, metal screaming as aircraft dropped from the sky like toys with their strings cut. They didn't hit the ground. They froze. Hundreds of tons of steel and fuel hung motionless above the city, locked in place by something invisible and indifferent. Sirens cut off mid-wail. Screens went black. Even the wind seemed unsure if it was allowed to move anymore. At the center of that impossible stillness hovered a slender purple figure, arms crossed, tail flicking lazily as golden eyes swept over the city with open boredom. Beerus yawned. On the streets below, panic didn't explode all at once. It crept. People stumbled, looked around, checked their phones that no longer worked, and finally looked up. Fear spread not because something was attacking them, but because something wasn't reacting to them at all. This wasn't a disaster. Disasters followed rules. This felt like inspection. Vought Tower went into immediate lockdown. Ashley Barrett's voice echoed through the command floor as feeds tried and failed to reconnect, technicians shouting over one another as systems refused to respond. Every sensor screamed nonsense data. Power spikes without sources. Energy readings without scale. The world's most expensive threat detection network had nothing to compare this to, and that terrified everyone in the room. "Where is Homelander?" Ashley demanded. "He's already airborne," someone replied. Of course he was. Homelander shot up through the frozen airspace like a bullet, cape flaring, jaw set into the confident smile he'd perfected over years of being worshipped. This was his job. Unknown threat over New York meant one thing. Cameras would be watching, even if they weren't working right now. This was where he mattered. He stopped 20 feet from Beerus, hovering, posture relaxed but tense underneath. "All right," Homelander said, voice carrying, practiced, and authoritative. "You're gonna want to explain what you're doing here." Beerus didn't turn his head. He glanced instead at the city below, at the frozen helicopters, the stalled traffic, the millions of fragile lives continuing only because he hadn't decided otherwise yet. His ears twitched slightly, reacting to a sound no one else could hear. "How loud?" Beerus murmured. Homelander's smile tightened. "Hey," he said, louder now, "I'm talking to you." Beerus sighed. He raised one finger, not toward Homelander but toward the skyline behind him, and tapped the air gently, like a man testing glass. A Vought high-rise 3 blocks away ceased to exist. It didn't explode. It didn't collapse. One instant it was there, glass and steel reflecting the sun. The next, there was a rectangular absence in the skyline, the air rushing inward to fill the space where tens of thousands of tons of matter had been erased. The shockwave arrived a second later, windows shattering across the district as people screamed and dropped to the ground. Homelander flinched. Not because he was hurt, because nothing had touched him at all. On the streets, the boys were already moving. Butcher stared upward from behind an abandoned car, teeth clenched around an unlit cigarette. He didn't need a readout to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't a soup. This wasn't a weapon. This was something that made every nightmare he'd ever planned for feel embarrassingly small. "Tell me we're not involved," Huey said, voice shaking as he watched the empty space where the building had been. "We're very involved," Butcher muttered. "We're just not relevant." Back in the air, Homelander tried to recover. "Okay," he said, forcing a laugh, spreading his hands. "Big entrance, I get it, but you can't just..." Beerus turned his head at last. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was the same expression someone might give a barking dog that had interrupted a nap. Homelander felt it hit him like a physical blow, a pressure behind his eyes that made his stomach twist. "You're the one making the noise," Beerus said calmly. Homelander's posture shifted despite himself, irritation bleeding into something sharper. "I'm the one who protects this planet." Beerus blinked once. "Oh," he replied, "is that what this is?" The air warped. Homelander was suddenly not hovering anymore. He was falling, dragged downward by a gravity that obeyed Beerus and no one else. He caught himself inches above the street, boots cracking asphalt as he landed hard, surrounded by screaming civilians who scattered in blind panic. Beerus descended slowly, feet never touching the ground, eyes never leaving Homelander. "Stand," Beerus said, not as a command but an expectation. Homelander stood. Every instinct screamed at him to attack, to prove himself, to show strength the only way he knew how. He launched forward, fist cocked, moving faster than sound, every ounce of power focused into a strike that had flattened armies and cities alike. Beerus caught it. Two fingers closed around Homelander's fist, stopping it completely. The shockwave still tore outward, shattering storefronts and flipping cars, but Beerus didn't move an inch. He looked down at the trapped hand with mild curiosity. "That's it?" he asked. Homelander tried to pull free. He couldn't. Fear flooded his face before he could stop it, raw and naked and utterly human. Beerus released him casually, stepping back as Homelander staggered, nearly losing his balance. Around them, the city watched. Vought feeds tried desperately to spin back online. Military units mobilized and immediately froze when targeting systems refused to lock. Subs across the country felt something shift in the air, a pressure they didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Beerus folded his arms again. "This world," he said, surveying the chaos, "mistakes volume for worth." He glanced at Homelander one last time, tail flicking with mild annoyance. "I haven't decided what to do with it yet." The frozen helicopters began to fall. Not slowly. All at once. And as New York erupted into uncontrolled catastrophe beneath him, Beerus floated higher, watching carefully, judging whether this universe deserved correction or deletion. The helicopters hit the streets like falling meteorites. Steel tore through concrete. Fuel ignited. Shockwaves rolled outward, shattering storefronts and throwing people off their feet as fire bloomed across multiple blocks at once. New York descended into chaos in seconds, not because Beerus attacked, but because he stopped caring whether things continued to function. Homelander moved on instinct, grabbing a falling chopper mid-descent and hurling it toward the river, then darting to intercept another before it could plow into a crowded intersection. Normally, this would have been the moment. Cameras, applause, the image of salvation carved into memory. No one was watching him. Everyone was watching the purple god floating above the skyline, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded, observing destruction like it was a mildly interesting weather pattern. Homelander felt it then, not fear yet, something worse. Irrelevance. Vought Tower was spiraling. Ashley Barrett stood at the center of the command floor as executives shouted into dead phones and analysts screamed about systems that refused to respond. Military liaisons demanded answers she didn't have. PR teams begged for something, anything, to frame, spin, soften. "We need to engage him," someone said. "Say he's hostile, say Homelander's handling it." Ashley swallowed hard. On what authority? No one answered. Every attempt to classify Beerus failed instantly. Threat models broke. Risk assessments returned blank. He didn't fit any category Vought had built its empire around. Sups could be marketed. Weapons could be negotiated. Even disasters could be spun. Beerus didn't participate. On the street, the boys regrouped behind cover as emergency services collapsed around them. "This is it," Huey said, voice shaking as he watched a building burn unchecked. "This is the thing that kills everyone." "No," Butcher replied, eyes locked on Beerus. "This is the thing that makes everyone realize they were lying to themselves." MM checked his weapon out of habit, then lowered it slowly. "We can't do anything," he said, "not even a little." Frenchie laughed weakly. "That's new." Above them, Homelander finally snapped. He shot back into the air, positioning himself directly in Beerus. Line of sight, chest out, voice raised, desperation creeping through the confidence. "Hey," Homelander shouted, "people are dying down there because of you." Beerus tilted his head slightly, considering the statement. "They were dying before I arrived," he replied. "You just made it louder." Homelander clenched his fists. "You don't get to judge us. This is my world." Beerus stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Amused. "Ah," Beerus said, "you're the loudest one." Homelander lunged again, heat vision flaring, pouring everything he had into a sustained blast that carved a glowing line through the sky straight at Beerus' chest. The beam hit and vanished, not deflected, not absorbed, simply erased the moment it touched Beerus' aura. Beerus yawned mid-attack. The beam cut off as Homelander stared in disbelief, his eyes burning, his breath coming fast. He tried again, pouring more power into it, screaming now, rage and terror bleeding together. Beerus raised one finger. The air snapped. Homelander was slammed into the ground like a thrown doll, driven straight through asphalt and concrete until he stopped 3 stories down in a crater shaped like his own outline. The impact rippled outward, toppling cars and shattering glass. Beerus didn't follow. He looked away. That was worse. Around the world, the response escalated. Missile silos went to readiness. Fighter jets scrambled and immediately lost avionics as they approached the city. Naval groups rerouted, then stopped when their systems reported impossible readings. Satellites focused on Beerus and began failing one by one, blinded or erased depending on how close they looked. Governments realized the same thing at once. Force was irrelevant. This wasn't an invasion. It was an audit. Back in the crater, Homelander pushed himself up slowly, blood running from his nose, ears ringing. He looked up and saw Beerus still floating there, still bored, still untouched. Something inside him fractured. He flew back up, slower this time, voice shaking despite himself. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Money, control, worship." Beerus finally looked directly at him again. "I want quiet," he said simply. "And I want to know why this universe confuses cruelty with authority." Homelander opened his mouth. Nothing came out. On the ground, Butcher watched the exchange with a grim, almost satisfied expression. "He's done," he muttered, He just doesn't know it yet. The escalation came without warning. Beerus drifted toward Vought Tower, eyes narrowing slightly at the sheer density of activity inside. The building's defenses activated automatically. Energy shields, countermeasures, protocols designed to withstand anything short of a nuclear strike. Beerus tapped the barrier once. Vought Tower folded inward like paper. Not collapsed. Folded. Entire floors vanished as the structure compacted into itself, glass and steel compressing into a dense, useless mass before dissolving into nothing. The skyline screamed as alarms cut out mid-note and smoke poured into the sky where the heart of corporate power had been. Ashley Barrett never saw it coming. Neither did the world. Beerus hovered in the empty space where the tower had been, tail flicking with mild satisfaction. Too loud, he said. Silence followed. Not peace. Shock. Homelander hovered nearby, shaking, staring at the absence where his entire identity had been manufactured. The cameras were gone. The handlers were gone. The applause machine was gone. Beerus glanced at him one last time. You, he said almost thoughtfully, are unfinished. Homelander didn't answer. He couldn't. Below, fires burned unchecked. Emergency crews overwhelmed, authority shattered. The boys watched the skyline change permanently, knowing nothing would ever be put back the way it was. Beerus turned his attention outward, toward the rest of the planet. This will take a while, he said. And somewhere deep in the cosmos, judgment continued forming, not in anger but in decision. The world tried to respond the only way it knew how. Within hours of Vought Tower's erasure, emergency summits convened across continents. Governments that had spent decades quietly outsourcing fear to superheroes suddenly found themselves without a shield, without a narrative, and without a contingency that mattered. Vought International, once the axis around which global superpower politics quietly rotated, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Its servers were gone. Its headquarters was gone. Its authority evaporated with a single bored gesture from a god who hadn't even asked its name. Beerus noticed none of this at first. He floated above the Atlantic coast, legs crossed in midair, watching the sun rise over a planet that suddenly felt much smaller than it had the day before. Ships had stopped moving. Aircraft avoided the entire eastern seaboard. The world had instinctively decided that proximity was dangerous, even if it didn't yet understand why. Wise hovered nearby, staff resting lightly against his shoulder, expression calm and curious. He had said very little since arriving, content to observe how this universe reacted when stripped of its illusions. They're scrambling, Wise noted casually. How quaint. Beerus hummed in agreement. They always do, noise when threatened, silence when corrected. In Washington, a joint task force attempted what Vought no longer could. A transmission was sent. Not a weapon, not a threat. A message. It was projected into the sky over New York using every surviving satellite and broadcast system they could muster. A carefully worded appeal authored by diplomats, psychologists, and theologians working in terrified collaboration. It spoke of peace, misunderstanding, cooperation, and mutual respect between powerful entities. Beerus watched it scroll across the clouds. He waited until it finished. Then he snapped his fingers. The message vanished, not just from the sky but from every system that had transmitted it. Records wiped, backups gone. Even the memory of the signal degraded in databases, corrupted beyond recovery. It was as if the universe itself had rejected the idea. Disrespectful, Beerus muttered. On the ground, the boys listened to the fallout through emergency radios that barely worked anymore. Static dominated most channels, but enough leaked through to paint a picture of escalating panic and collapsing coordination. They're trying to talk to him, Huey said incredulously. Like he's a hostile CEO. Butcher snorted. Old habits die hard. Shook his head slowly. This ain't about power anymore. This is about permission. That truth hit home minutes later. A private military convoy attempted to move into the evacuation zone around Manhattan, carrying experimental weapons Vought had quietly funded years earlier. The plan wasn't to attack Beerus directly. It was to establish relevance, to show that humanity still had teeth. Beerus noticed the convoy the moment it crossed an invisible line he hadn't marked out loud. He looked down, mildly curious. The vehicles disintegrated. No blast, no wreckage. The entire convoy vanished mid-motion, leaving behind nothing but scorched pavement and confused witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what absence looked like. That was the moment the world understood. This wasn't escalation. It was filtration. Homelander watched it all from a distance, hovering above the ruins of what had once been his kingdom. He hadn't spoken since Beerus erased Vought Tower. His breathing was uneven. His posture sagged in a way no one had ever seen before. For the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do that mattered. Beerus finally turned toward him again. "You keep hovering," Beerus said, tone flat. "Are you waiting for permission?" Homelander swallowed. I can help," he said quickly. "I can keep order. People listen to me." Beerus' eyes narrowed just slightly. "They listen because they're afraid," he replied. "That is not order, that is delay." Homelander opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The words wouldn't come. Every justification he'd ever used felt paper-thin under Beerus' gaze. Below them, emergency broadcasts shifted tone, not defiant anymore, not hopeful. Resigned. Cities began self-evacuating without orders. Borders closed not to keep enemies out, but to slow panic from spreading too fast. Religions split overnight, some calling Beerus a devil, others calling him proof that their gods had always been smaller than advertised. The boys watched people react in real time. Frenchie broke the silence first. "So this is what it looks like," he said quietly. "End of the lie." Butcher didn't respond. He was watching Homelander, really watching him, seeing a man who had built himself on being untouchable finally understand what that word actually meant. The next attempt came from somewhere unexpected. A surviving Vought executive, operating from a secure bunker overseas, authorized the release of classified footage. Experiments, cover-ups, deaths, all the skeletons Vought had hidden for decades. The idea was simple. If they couldn't control Beerus, they could at least poison the world against the systems he was judging, redirecting his attention away from themselves. The footage went live. Beerus watched for exactly 10 seconds. Then he erased the bunker. Not just the building. The entire region around it ceased to exist, land flattened into glassy nothingness where geography simply ended. The message was clear, even to those who hadn't seen it directly. Do not attempt to bargain with judgment. Wise smiled faintly. They're learning. Yes, Beerus agreed, slowly. The planet changed shape that day. Not physically, psychologically. Authority no longer came from uniforms, wealth, or force. It came from proximity to survival. People stopped asking who was in charge and started asking what behaviors drew attention. The boys felt it too. Lowered his weapon fully. This isn't our fight anymore. Butcher exhaled slowly. Never was, he admitted. We just thought it was. Above them, Beerus stretched, finally looking something like satisfied. I've seen enough, he said. The verdict is forming. Homelander flinched at the word. Verdict, he asked hoarsely. Beerus looked at him one last time, expression unreadable. Yes, he said, and you're part of the evidence. The sky darkened suddenly, not with clouds but with pressure, reality tightening like a held breath. Across the planet, sensitive instruments spiked and failed, ancient fault lines groaned, and something deep and foundational began to shift. Judgment was moving from observation to action. And whatever came next would not be reversible. The first city to fall was New York. It was Los Angeles. Not because Beerus chose it, but because the world did. When the West Coast woke to half-understood footage of Manhattan's skyline missing pieces and Vought Tower erased from history, panic metastasized into something uglier than fear. Sups took to the air without orders. Police abandoned perimeters. Private security firms flooded the streets with armored vehicles, each one trying to assert relevance before relevance stopped mattering. Beerus noticed the noise from orbit. He hovered above the Pacific now, legs crossed, watching a coastal sprawl turn on itself. Fires burned without origin. Traffic collapsed into knots of violence and desperation. Sups fought one another in the open, old grudges erupting as cameras rolled and control slipped. The lie that heroes kept order finally ran out of room to hide. "Messy," Beerus remarked. Wise tilted his head. "You could intervene." Beerus' ears twitched. "Why would I? They're showing me who they are." In Los Angeles, Homelander arrived late. Not because he couldn't get there fast enough, but because he hesitated. The air felt different now, heavier, like the world itself had learned to flinch. When he landed on a freeway interchange already torn apart by soup brawls and burning vehicles, the crowd didn't cheer. They screamed and scattered. Someone threw a rock. It bounced off his chest harmlessly, but the sound hit harder than any punch Beerus had given him. Homelander opened his mouth to speak, to reassure, to threaten, to do something familiar. What came out instead was a demand. Everybody calm down. No one listened. Above the city, Beerus appeared without sound, hovering where the sun should have been, casting a long shadow that rolled across skyscrapers and freeways alike. The fighting slowed, then stopped entirely as people looked up and felt the same crushing certainty. This wasn't another soup. This was the end of pretending. Homelander felt his throat tighten. "I've got this," he said quickly, looking up at Beerus, then back at the city like he could still claim it. "I can fix this." Beerus regarded him with mild interest. "Fix what?" "The chaos," Homelander replied, voice cracking. "They just need direction." Beerus' gaze swept the city again, taking in the looting, the fires, the terrified civilians crushed between failed gods. "Direction is not obedience," he said, "and obedience is not stability." He raised one finger. Every soup in the city froze mid-motion. Not paralyzed by fear, paralyzed by reality itself refusing to allow them to continue. Heat vision died in throats. Superspeed stalled into stillness. Powers winked out like candles snuffed by an unseen wind. One by one, they fell to the ground, ordinary and screaming. Beerus lowered his hand. "Power," he said calmly, "that requires worship to function is a defect." The world watched live. Phones worked here. Cameras rolled. Millions saw Sups crying, bleeding, suddenly small. Governments tried to cut feeds and failed. The collapse had gone public and there was no spinning it back. On a rooftop miles away, the boys watched the city unravel in silence. "This is different," Huey whispered. "He's not just destroying things." Butcher nodded slowly. "He's rewriting the rules." Military escalation followed within minutes, not out of confidence, but habit. A carrier group off the coast launched a test salvo, missiles streaking toward Beerus in perfect formation. A final ritual of relevance performed for an audience that no longer cared. Beerus glanced at them. The missiles stopped, reversed direction, and fell harmlessly into the ocean, detonating beneath the waves in a chain of distant, muted thuds. No firestorm, no spectacle. Just dismissal. On command bridges around the world, generals went pale. Homelander drifted closer, desperation stripping away arrogance. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can work together." Beerus finally turned fully toward him. "I am doing this," he replied. "You are confusing participation with permission." Homelander felt the truth of it settle into his bones. He was no longer an asset. He was a variable, and variables were expendable. Beerus extended his hand toward the city, not to destroy it, but to weigh it. The air thickened, pressing down on buildings, on people, on the idea that anything here had ever been stable. Cracks spiderwebbed through glass and concrete as if gravity itself were reconsidering its commitments. Then Beerus stopped. He closed his hand slowly. Lowe's angels remained. Barely. He looked dissatisfied. "Survival by inertia," he said, "unimpressive." Across the globe, fault lines shifted. Economies halted. Religions fractured further. The concept of hero died in real time, replaced by a quieter, colder understanding that power without accountability was not protection. It was noise waiting to be silenced. Beerus turned away from the city, gaze lifting toward the planet as a whole. "The evaluation continues," he announced, voice carrying everywhere at once. Homelander hovered behind him, small and shaking, watching the world realize it had never been the apex. Far above the atmosphere, something responded. Not a weapon. A presence. Ancient sensors buried deep in space stations and black-budget observatories spiked simultaneously, detecting a shift that had nothing to do with Beerus and everything to do with consequence. The universe, it seemed, had noticed judgment happening in one of its quieter corners. Wise smile faded just slightly. "Oh my," he said, "that's unusual." Beerus' eyes narrowed, not in fear but in interest. "Well," he replied, "now that's new." The sky over Earth darkened again, not with pressure this time but with attention, as something else began to look back. The attention didn't arrive like Beerus had. There was no silence, no casual dismissal of physics, no effortless assertion of authority. This presence announced itself through reaction. Across the planet, instruments that hadn't functioned since the Cold War lit up and failed in rapid succession. Deep space arrays registered distortions that didn't map to any known phenomenon. Even Beerus' pressure, the oppressive weight that had hung over Earth since his arrival, shifted slightly, as if something had nudged it from the outside. Beerus felt it immediately. He straightened in midair, arms unfolding for the first time since he'd begun his evaluation. His expression didn't change much, but the boredom drained away, replaced by something sharper. Not concern, recognition. "So," he said quietly, "someone's listening." Wise floated beside him, staff glowing faintly. "This universe has been quiet for a long time," he observed. "You tend to draw attention when you judge out loud." Below them, the world reeled. Lowe's angels was still standing, but barely functioning. Sups who'd lost their powers scrambled to hide, to explain, to survive in a world that had turned on them in seconds. Civilians didn't know who to fear anymore. The sky had become a threat all on its own, and every glance upward carried the same question. "Is it done?" Homelander hovered a cautious distance from Beerus, close enough to be seen, far enough to feel like he wasn't intruding. He felt the shift too, though he didn't understand it. All he knew was that the air had changed again, heavier and colder, like standing between two storms. "What is that?" he asked, voice low. Beerus didn't look at him. "Something that disagrees," he replied, "or something curious. Either way, it's rude." The response came not from the sky, but from everywhere else. Power grids across 3 continents failed simultaneously, not overloaded, not sabotaged, simply disconnected, as if the concept of electricity had been briefly misfiled. Oceans surged without storms. Satellites tumbled out of orbit, not destroyed, but gently pushed aside like debris in a current no one could see. The boys watched it unfold from a commandeered emergency shelter miles inland, maps and feeds breaking down faster than they could be updated. "This isn't Beerus," MM said slowly. "This is something else reacting to him." Butcher leaned back against a concrete wall, eyes narrowed. Figures. Universe finally notices the bloke who doesn't knock. Frenchie laughed nervously. Do we even matter anymore? No one answered. High above the planet, something pressed closer. It didn't manifest physically. Not yet. It asserted itself through correction. Beerus, influence met resistance, not in force but in boundary. The way a body reacts when something foreign enters the bloodstream. Beerus felt it like friction. He muttered, that's new. He raised his hand and erased a chunk of empty space above the atmosphere, not targeting anything specific, just testing. The void rippled and snapped back into place immediately, reality repairing itself faster than expected. Y's eyes widened a fraction. Interesting, this universe has opinions. Beerus smiled. Oh, this will be quick then. The escalation wasn't a battle. It was a negotiation. The universe wasn't equipped to win. Beerus didn't attack the presence directly. He adjusted. His pressure intensified, not outward but inward, compressing his authority into something cleaner, more precise. Where before he had been a looming judgment, now he was a scalpel. The effect was immediate. Entire regions of instability vanished. Fault lines stilled. Power grids snapped back online in places that hadn't even realized they'd gone dark. The universe's pushback faltered, recalculating. On Earth, people felt it as relief that came too late to be comforting. Homelander looked around, confused. Did we pass? Beerus finally turned toward him. You, he said, no. Homelander flinched. Beerus drifted closer, close enough now that Homelander could feel the heatless pressure radiating off him, the sense that standing here was a privilege being temporarily extended. The universe questioned my method, Beerus continued, not my conclusion. He looked back toward the planet. And it was wrong. That was when Beerus escalated properly. Not with destruction, but with demonstration. Across the globe, every remaining soup felt it at once. Powers flickered, strength wavered, invulnerability stuttered like a bad signal, not removed, not erased. Measured. Beerus was weighing them, one by one, not as individuals but as a category. The effect was surgical and horrifying. Sups collapsed in streets. Some screamed as abilities they'd never questioned failed them for the first time. Others begged, prayed, tried to fly and fell instead. The world watched its gods become conditional. Vaught's remnants didn't survive the minute. Beerus didn't erase them physically this time. He erased their relevance. Financial systems locked. Assets dissolved. Contracts ceased to exist as legal concepts. Corporate structures unraveled as if they'd never been valid to begin with. Governments found their agreements voided, signatures wiped from existence. Authority, Beerus said softly, is not inherited. Homelander shook, barely holding himself together. You're destroying everything, he whispered. Beerus glanced at him with mild annoyance. No, he corrected, I'm removing noise. The presence above the planet surged again, more urgently now. Not attacking, not retreating. Warning. Wise frowned slightly. It seems to be requesting restraint. Beerus rolled his shoulders. It should have asked earlier. He raised his hand toward the sky, not in threat, but in acknowledgement, and spoke one word that wasn't meant for human ears. Space itself recoiled, folding subtly around the planet, not breaking but deferring. The universe backed off. Not defeated. Outranked. The consequences hit Earth seconds later. Gravity stabilized permanently across several unstable regions. Weather patterns locked into new, harsher normals. Entire coastlines shifted by meters, not enough to flood cities immediately, but enough to redraw maps forever. This wasn't punishment. It was correction. The boys felt it under their feet. The planet's changed, Huey said quietly, like it just accepted something. Butcher nodded grimly. Yeah, that it's not in charge anymore. Beerus lowered his hand, satisfaction evident now. Good, he said. Now we can continue. He turned back toward Homelander, who was barely hovering, eyes hollow, cape fluttering uselessly. You represent this world's misunderstanding, Beerus said. Power without accountability, authority without permission. Homelander tried to speak. Beerus didn't let him. He snapped his fingers. Homelander didn't disappear. He fell. Not slammed, not thrown. Simply dropped, his powers suppressed just enough to send him crashing into the street below like an ordinary man, bones shattering, blood pooling, cameras catching every second of it. Beerus looked down at the impact site, unimpressed. Live, he said, for now. Above Earth, the presence receded, wounded pride cooling into watchfulness. Beerus stretched again, as if settling in. The universe is paying attention, he said to Wise. Good, that means this matters. And far below, as Homelander lay broken and the world reeled from irreversible change, Beerus turned his gaze toward the next question. What exactly was worth sparing? Homelander didn't die on impact. That fact alone confused everyone watching. He lay twisted in the street where he'd fallen, blood pooling beneath him, one arm bent at an angle that made medics flinch even from a distance. Sirens wailed and then cut out as emergency crews hesitated, unsure whether approaching him was allowed, or safe, or even relevant anymore. The strongest man in the world had become an unanswered question bleeding on asphalt. Beerus watched for exactly 3 seconds. Then he lost interest. Pain, he said mildly, hovering above the city again, is educational. Death is final. I'm still deciding what lesson this species needs. Wise glanced down at the ruined street. You left him alive. Yes, Beerus replied. Mercy would imply concern. This is neither mercy nor cruelty. This is instruction. Across the globe, the effects of Beerus' correction deepened. Subs who had survived the earlier suppression began discovering limits they'd never had before. Powers flickered unpredictably. Strength surged and vanished without warning. Healing slowed. Invulnerability cracked. They weren't powerless, but they were no longer consistent. The very thing that had made them untouchable had become unreliable, and panic followed close behind. In Chicago, a speedster ran headlong into a wall he hadn't expected to be solid. In Berlin, a pyrokinetic burned himself alive when his flames refused to extinguish. In Tokyo, a flying soup plummeted from the sky mid-rescue. There was no pattern, no rule anyone could identify. Beerus wasn't removing powers. He was taxing them. The boys watched the fallout through patched-together feeds, none of them speaking for a long time. Huey finally broke the silence. He's not killing them, he said. He's making them normal. Worse, Butcher replied grimly. He's making them accountable. That accountability rippled outward immediately. Without consistent powers, SUPs stopped taking orders. Private security contracts dissolved overnight as liability became impossible to calculate. Governments quietly issued detainment orders for their own enhanced assets, suddenly aware that instability was more dangerous than strength. Vaught's remnants tried to regroup. It lasted less than an hour. A hidden board meeting convened in Zurich, executives and lawyers scrambling to reconstitute authority through paperwork and old influence. Beerus noticed the concentration of frantic intent like an itch. He appeared in the room without sound. The executives froze, mid-argument, mid-breath, mid-denial. Beerus looked around at the polished table, the trembling hands clutching tablets, the sheer audacity of people who still thought process mattered. Ah, he said, noise. They tried to speak. Beerus lifted one finger. The concept of Vought International ceased to exist. Not the people, not the buildings, the entity. Legal frameworks unraveled, ownership dissolved, Contracts invalidated themselves. The corporation was erased as an idea, leaving behind humans suddenly exposed to consequences they'd never planned for. Beerus vanished. The world felt the absence immediately. Markets crashed not from fear, but from confusion. Entire industries lost their organizing principle overnight. The illusion that power could be centralized collapsed completely. Homelander woke in a hospital room hours later. His body was restrained more for safety than necessity. Bones healed slowly. Pain lingered. For the first time in his life, healing wasn't instant. He stared at the ceiling, breathing shallowly, listening to the absence of applause. Ashley Barrett stood at the foot of the bed, face pale, eyes rimmed red. "They're gone," she said quietly. "All of it, Vought, the board, the contracts." Homelander swallowed. "Beerus." Ashley nodded. He didn't even look at us. Something inside Homelander finally collapsed. Not rage, not grief. Emptiness. Across the planet, governments adjusted their language. Emergency declarations replaced heroic rhetoric. SUPs were no longer called protectors. They were designated variables, risk factors, unstable assets requiring oversight. The age of worship ended not with rebellion, but with paperwork and fear. Beerus observed it all from orbit, arms folded, tail swaying lazily. "They adapt quickly when frightened," he noted. Wise smiled faintly. "Fear is a powerful teacher." Beerus' gaze hardened. "Fear is insufficient, they must remember." The next escalation came not from Beerus, but from humanity. A coalition of remaining military powers launched a coordinated global response, not at Beerus directly, but at what they believed was the source of his interest. SUPs were targeted for containment en masse. Facilities were raided. Enhanced individuals were detained, interrogated, sometimes executed when control failed. The world overcorrected. Beerus noticed the bloodshed almost immediately. He appeared above a battlefield in Eastern Europe where a regiment had cornered a group of frightened, unstable SUPs. Weapons fired. Powers flared unpredictably. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Beerus sighed. "This," he said, "is why judgment is not mercy." He descended between the two sides and clapped his hands once. The battlefield froze. Soldiers, SUPs, vehicles, even drifting smoke locked in place like a paused film. Beerus walked calmly through the suspended chaos, examining faces twisted in fear, anger, and desperation. "You see," he said to no one in particular, "remove false gods and they create new rituals of violence." He snapped his fingers. Every weapon in the area disintegrated. Not exploded. Disintegrated. Beerus turned, addressing the frozen soldiers directly. "You do not correct imbalance by swinging wildly," he said. "You learn restraint or you are corrected next." He released the pause. People collapsed, disoriented, staring at empty hands where rifles and cannons had been seconds earlier. The SUPs fled. The soldiers did not pursue. The message spread faster than any broadcast. Beerus was not protecting SUPs. He was limiting everyone. The boys felt it shift immediately. "He's not picking sides," MM said quietly. "He's erasing the game." Butcher stared at the sky. "Yeah, and that's worse." Beerus returned to New York as night fell again, hovering above a city permanently altered. Fires burned less brightly now. People moved cautiously. The noise had dimmed. Homelander was brought out onto a rooftop under heavy guard, barely able to stand on his own. He looked up at Beerus with hollow eyes, stripped of certainty, stripped of narrative. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked. Beerus studied him for a long moment. "You are not the worst thing here," Beerus said finally, "just the most misleading." Homelander's breath hitched. "So I live." Beerus turned away, for now. Below them, the city waited, holding its breath. Above them, the universe remained watchful, boundaries still sensitive from correction. Beerus' judgment was not finished. It was narrowing. And the next decision would not be about corporations, or weapons, or false gods. It would be about whether this world had earned the right to keep choosing at all. Resistance didn't end with a declaration. It ended with exhaustion. By the 7th day of Beerus' presence, the world had burned through every familiar response. Military escalation had failed. Corporate manipulation had been erased. Religious defiance fractured under the weight of a god that didn't care to be worshipped. Even rebellion lost its shape when there was no authority left to rebel against. What remained was fear without direction. Cities didn't riot anymore. They withdrew. Streets emptied at dusk. Curfews enforced themselves without orders because people understood, instinctively, that attention was dangerous. The sky had become a threat vector, and every loud action felt like a gamble with extinction. Beerus noticed the quiet. He hovered above the Himalayas now, watching weather systems reroute themselves around invisible pressure, snow falling in patterns that hadn't existed before. The planet was adjusting, not healing but settling into a new posture, one of submission mixed with uncertainty. "Silence," Beerus said thoughtfully, "much better." Wise glanced down at the earth, staff glowing faintly. "They've stopped resisting." "They've stopped pretending," Beerus corrected. "Resistance implies relevance." On the ground, the boys moved through the ruins of their former purpose. They weren't hunted. They weren't heroes. They were just people again, watching a world that no longer needed exposing because the lie had collapsed on its own. Butcher still carried his weapons out of habit, though he knew better than to point them at the sky. "This is the part I didn't plan for," he admitted quietly, watching civilians dismantle a vandalized soup statue with bare hands. No anger, no ceremony, just removal. Huey swallowed. "So what happens to people like us?" Butcher didn't answer. He didn't have one. The escalation came quietly, the way Beerus preferred. Across the planet, entire categories of authority began to fail. Not violently, functionally. Emergency powers expired and couldn't be renewed. Executive orders were issued and ignored without consequence. Courts convened and found themselves unable to enforce rulings when no one believed the system mattered anymore. Beerus wasn't destroying governments. He was letting them starve. Homelander felt it most acutely. He was released from medical custody not because anyone trusted him, but because no one knew what to do with him. Without Vought, without handlers, without a role, he drifted through secure facilities like a ghost. Guards watched him with fear instead of awe. Doctors spoke to him like a liability. No one asked him to save anything. He found himself standing alone on a rooftop one night, staring out over a city that didn't look up anymore. His powers flickered, strong one moment, unreliable the next, like the world itself was undecided about whether he deserved them. Beerus appeared beside him without warning. Homelander flinched hard enough to nearly fall. "Still here," Beerus said, not unkindly. "You've lasted longer than most." Homelander laughed weakly. "I don't know how." Beerus regarded him for a long moment. "Neither do I." Homelander turned toward him, desperation spilling over at last. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I can change. I can be better. Just tell me." Beerus' ears twitched. "That," he replied, "is the problem." He leaned closer, eyes boring into Homelander's. "You were never taught choice, only performance. You don't want direction, you want absolution." Homelander's face crumpled. He had no answer for that. Beerus straightened and looked away. "You are not an enemy," he said. "You are a symptom." The words hit harder than any blow. Elsewhere, humanity tried one last time to matter. A coalition of nations attempted to convene a planetary summit, not to oppose Beerus, but to appeal to him collectively. Representatives gathered in Geneva, stripped of ceremony, stripped of security, Hopping numbers might substitute for relevance. Beerus noticed the gathering like one notices an itch. He appeared above the assembly hall, hovering where flags once flew. The delegates fell silent instantly, some kneeling, others frozen in place, all of them painfully aware that history had outpaced their language. "You want to speak," Beerus said. A representative stepped forward, hands shaking, voice rehearsed. He spoke of humanity's achievements, of art and culture and resilience, of the right to self-determination and the dangers of external judgment. Beerus listened. When the man finished, Beerus nodded once. Then he erased the concept of the summit. Not the people, not the building. The moment. Every document, every recording, every memory of the assembly blurred and faded. Delegates found themselves standing in an empty hall with no recollection of how they'd arrived or why they were there. The attempt at collective relevance vanished without resistance. Wise raised an eyebrow, decisive. Beerus yawned, predictable. That was when resistance finally died. Not with a battle, with realization. The world understood that Beerus did not need to be opposed because opposition required leverage. There was none. He wasn't conquering. He wasn't ruling. He wasn't even correcting out of obligation. He was deciding whether this experiment continued. The shift was immediate and irreversible. Communities reorganized locally. Mutual aid replaced spectacle. People stopped waiting for heroes and started reinforcing doors. Crime didn't vanish, but it changed shape, smaller, quieter, less theatrical. The age of grand gestures ended overnight. The boys saw it clearly. "He didn't save us," Huey said. "He just made us responsible." Butcher nodded. "Yeah, bastard." Beerus observed the adaptation with mild approval. "They're shrinking their ambitions," he said. "Good, that means they might survive." Wise smiled. "And if they do?" Beerus' expression cooled. "Then the verdict stands." Above the planet, pressure built again, not from Beerus but from consequence. Tectonic systems adjusted. Ecosystems shifted. The correction wasn't over. It was ongoing, like a scar that would never fully heal. Beerus turned his gaze back toward Earth, eyes narrowing as he focused on a single variable still unresolved. "Homelander. You," Beerus said, appearing before him one last time, "are the final test." Homelander stiffened. "Test for what?" Beerus' tail flicked lazily. "For whether this world can let go of what it worshipped." The air thickened around them. The city below went silent again. And for the first time since Beerus arrived, the next judgment wasn't about systems or symbols. It was about a single decision that would echo forever. The city felt it before it saw it. Not pressure this time, not gravity bending or systems failing. This was quieter, heavier in a way that settled into people's chests and refused to move. Streets emptied without orders. Windows went dark. Somewhere deep in the collective instinct of the population, something recognized that this moment mattered more than the last 7 days combined. Homelander stood at the center of it. He was on a rooftop overlooking Manhattan, not because he'd chosen the symbolism, but because there were fewer places left where he felt like he belonged. The skyline no longer inspired him. It accused him. Every missing building, every darkened district, every scar on the city felt like proof that his era had ended, and no one had bothered to ask his permission. Beerus hovered a short distance away, arms folded, expression unreadable. "You've been watching," Homelander said quietly. He wasn't posturing now. He couldn't. Everything that's happened, people changing, subs hiding, the world shrinking. Beerus nodded once. "Yes." Homelander swallowed. "So what am I supposed to be?" Beerus didn't answer immediately. He looked past Homelander, out over the city, watching people move cautiously through streets that used to host parades in Homelander's honor. No cheers, no chants, no cameras angled upward. When Beerus spoke again, his voice was calm, almost instructional. "You were never a protector," he said. "You were a performance calibrated to fear, useful until something quieter arrived." Homelander flinched as if struck. "I saved people," he insisted, the words sounding thin even to him. "I stopped wars, You delayed consequences," Beerus cut in. "You taught this world that cruelty could be forgiven if it wore a smile." The air thickened slightly, not threatening, just present, like a hand resting on a shoulder with too much weight behind it. "This world cannot move forward while it waits for you to tell it how to feel." Below them, people gathered at a distance without realizing why. Not cheering, not protesting, watching. The instinct to witness had returned even if belief had not. Phones came out, hesitant at first, then steadier. This time, no one was looking for a hero shot. They were watching a reckoning. Homelander noticed. "They're still looking at me," he said, a flicker of hope rising despite himself. "I can still matter." Beerus' eyes narrowed, not in anger but in decision. "Yes," he said, "that's the problem." He descended until his feet were level with Homelander's, close enough now that the difference between them was undeniable. Beerus didn't radiate menace. He radiated finality. "You matter too much in the wrong way," Beerus continued. "As long as you exist as you are, this world will wait for you to return. They will excuse you, fear you, imitate you." Homelander's breathing quickened. "So what?" he demanded, desperation breaking through again. "You're going to kill me." Beerus tilted his head slightly. "Death would preserve you." The meaning landed slowly. Homelander shook his head. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to decide I don't exist." Beerus' expression softened just a fraction, not with mercy, but with clarity. "I decide what is allowed to continue," he said. "Existence is conditional." The escalation came then. Not an attack. A removal. Beerus raised his hand, 2 fingers extended, and placed them gently against Homelander's chest. There was no flash, no explosion, no visible energy at all, just a quiet, absolute shift. Homelander screamed. Not in pain, in loss. His powers didn't vanish all at once. They unraveled. Strength bled away like water draining from a cracked vessel. His senses dulled, sound flattening, vision blurring as the world snapped into human scale for the first time in his life. The sky felt farther away. The city felt heavier. He collapsed to his knees. Beerus withdrew his hand. "I am not killing you," Beerus said calmly. "I am removing the lie." Homelander clawed at the rooftop, gasping, body shaking violently as the last remnants of invulnerability faded. He felt the wind now, the cold, the pain in joints he'd never noticed before. Every scar he'd ignored came screaming back at once. On the streets below, people watched in stunned silence as Homelander, the god, the tyrant, the icon, knelt and sobbed like a broken man. No one cheered. No one helped. The symbol was falling apart in real time. The boys watched from a nearby building, unable to look away. "Jesus," Huey whispered, "he's just a guy." Butcher said nothing. His face was hard, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the scene. This was everything he'd wanted and nothing like he'd imagined. Beerus turned away from Homelander and addressed the city itself, his voice carrying without force, without amplification. "This world will not be ruled by fear masquerading as protection," he said. "You will not outsource your responsibility to monsters and call it safety." People listened. Not because they loved him. Because they understood him. Homelander tried to stand and failed, collapsing again, hands scraping against concrete, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he choked, not to Beerus but to anyone. "I can change." Beerus looked back at him one last time. "You already have," he said. "That is the punishment." He snapped his fingers. Homelander didn't disappear. He stayed exactly where he was, alive, powerless, exposed, while something else vanished. The idea of Homelander evaporated. Across the planet, images of him flickered and failed. Statues cracked and crumbled. Merchandise disintegrated into worthless scraps. Digital records corrupted, not erased cleanly but degraded, distorted, stripped of reverence. His name became just another sound without weight. The world forgot how to worship him. What remained was a man kneeling on a rooftop, surrounded by silence, as the city below finally looked away. Beerus floated upward, satisfied. "One symbol removed," he said to Wise. "The verdict is nearly complete." But as the pressure eased and the city began to move again, carefully, quietly, something shifted elsewhere. Deep underground, in places Beerus had not yet bothered to notice, human fear began to organize. Not around a hero, around an idea. If gods could judge, then perhaps gods could be studied. And somewhere in the dark, plans were already forming that would force Beerus to decide whether this world's final mistake would be its last. Humanity didn't respond to judgment with acceptance. It responded with planning. The removal of Homelander shattered the last myth of invincibility, but it didn't remove fear. It concentrated it. Governments that had gone quiet didn't stay silent because they'd learned humility. They stayed silent because they were counting, calculating, and waiting for a window that might never open. Deep beneath continents, systems woke that had been designed for extinction-level scenarios. Not alien invasion, not nuclear war, something worse. A presence that invalidated escalation entirely. Beerus sensed it as background noise at first. A low, persistent irritation at the edge of his awareness, like static from a channel he hadn't tuned into. He ignored it. The planet had earned a moment of observation after losing its favorite lie. But Wise noticed. "They're aligning resources in unusual ways," Wise said casually, staff glowing as he traced invisible lines through space. Not military formations, not political alliances. Beerus glanced sideways. "Then what?" "Desperation architecture," Wise replied. "They're building a question." On the surface, life attempted to normalize. Cities reopened cautiously. Aid replaced spectacle. People stopped waiting for rescue and started counting supplies instead. The boys faded into irrelevance not because they'd failed, but because their enemy no longer needed exposing. Butcher felt it keenly, the loss of direction settling into his bones like old shrapnel. "We were made to tear down monsters," he muttered, watching the news from a dim apartment. "What do you do when the monster wins and leaves?" Huey didn't answer. He was watching a different feed, satellite imagery glitching in ways that felt familiar now, patterns repeating where there shouldn't be any. Beerus drifted above the planet's curve, watching human activity with detached curiosity. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't guarding. He was waiting to see if the verdict held. Then the world blinked. Not figuratively. Literally. Every satellite went dark at once. Communication stalled. GPS collapsed. Power grids hiccuped and stabilized under emergency protocols that hadn't been tested outside simulations. For 10 seconds, Earth existed without a digital nervous system. Beerus' eyes narrowed. "That was deliberate," he said. Wise smiled thinly. "They've learned not to announce themselves." The escalation followed immediately. A signal burst outward from Earth, not an attack, not a weaponized frequency, but a structured query encoded into spacetime itself. It wasn't aimed at Beerus' body. It was aimed at his authority. Beerus felt it like a tug at his title. For the first time since his arrival, something asked him a question he hadn't approved. "What is this?" Beerus asked, voice colder now. Wise examined the signal, staff humming. "They're not trying to hurt you," he said. "They're trying to define you." On Earth, The facility responsible lay buried beneath a decommissioned research complex that officially didn't exist anymore. It was staffed by scientists, not soldiers. Physicists, theologians, systems theorists, people who'd spent their lives studying power without possessing it. They called it the threshold engine. Not a weapon. A lens. The premise was simple and suicidal. If Beerus operated on cosmic authority, then that authority must interface with rules. Titles implied structures. Structures implied boundaries. The engine wasn't designed to stop Beerus. It was designed to observe the limits of judgment itself. When the system activated, reality around the facility warped subtly. Time didn't slow. Space didn't tear. Instead, causality stuttered like a sentence interrupted mid-thought. Beerus felt the irritation sharpen into focus. He vanished. Reappearing above the complex, Beerus regarded the structure with open displeasure. Concrete buckled under his presence alone. Scientists froze at their stations, some weeping, others too far gone to stop working. "You are very bold," Beerus said, floating down into the chamber without resistance. "And very stupid." A lead researcher stepped forward, hands shaking but voice steady. "We're not trying to stop you," she said. "We're trying to understand what you consider sufficient." Beerus stared at her. "Existence," she continued, swallowing hard, "needs criteria. If you are judgment, then judgment can be evaluated." Silence stretched. Then Beerus laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly. Amused. "So," he said, "you wish to audit a god?" The researcher nodded. "If we don't, this world will never stop fearing you." Beerus' smile vanished. "That fear," he replied calmly, "is the only thing keeping you alive." He raised a finger. Wise stepped forward. "Lord Beerus," he said gently, "may I?" Beerus paused, considering, then lowered his hand. "You have 10 seconds." The threshold engine pulsed. For a moment, just one, the universe behaved strangely. Beerus felt something impossible. Perspective. Not weakness, not resistance. Reference. The engine didn't restrain him. It contextualized him. It forced a frame around his judgment, asking a question without language. If destruction is absolute, what does restraint mean? The moment snapped. The engine exploded inward, collapsing into itself and erasing the facility from existence in a perfect sphere. No debris, no survivors, no echo. Beerus hovered where it had been, eyes narrowed. That, he said slowly, was irritating. Wise studied him carefully, but... Beerus clenched his fist once, then relaxed it, but instructive. Across the planet, humanity felt the consequence instantly. Weather patterns stabilized unnaturally. Seismic activity halted mid-cycle. Chaos froze, then reset into a fragile equilibrium. Beerus hadn't punished the attempt. He'd acknowledged it. The verdict escalated. Not toward annihilation. Toward decision. Beerus turned his gaze back toward Earth as a whole, eyes sharp with interest now rather than boredom. "They have asked their final question," he said. "Now I will answer it." The sky darkened slightly, not with clouds but with attention. Every instinct on Earth screamed at once. This wasn't punishment. This was conclusion. Judgment didn't arrive as fire. It arrived as stillness. Across the planet, winds calmed, oceans settled, and systems that had been spiraling for days locked into an unnatural equilibrium. It wasn't peace. It was suspension, like the universe itself was holding a breath it wasn't sure it wanted to release. Every living thing felt it, from crowded cities to isolated outposts. The sense wasn't fear anymore. It was assessment. Beerus floated above Earth's atmosphere, arms folded, tail swaying slowly behind him. The boredom that had marked his arrival was gone now, replaced with something sharper. Focus. The threshold engine hadn't challenged him in the way mortals imagined, but it had done something more dangerous. It had asked why. Wise hovered beside him, expression unreadable. "They won't stop trying," he said gently, "even now." "No," Beerus replied. "They won't, that is their flaw and their merit." On the ground, the world waited. Governments didn't issue statements. Militaries stood down without orders. Emergency broadcasts cut to blank screens or looping static. People gathered in streets and open spaces not to protest, but because being indoors felt wrong, like hiding from a storm that wasn't moving. The boys watched from a half-abandoned newsroom, monitors flickering with dead feeds. "It feels like the end of something," Huey said quietly. Butcher nodded. "Yeah, just don't know if it's us." Beerus extended one finger. The escalation began. Not with destruction, but with selection. Across the planet, Beerus' attention narrowed, focusing on points of influence rather than power. Vought remnants, black site laboratories, military research hubs still running unsanctioned experiments. Not all of them vanished, only the ones still trying to rebuild the old lie. One by one, they ceased to exist. No explosions, no warnings. Facilities blinked out, leaving behind empty ground and confused satellites. Financial networks collapsed where they depended on those structures. Supply chains unraveled. Careers ended in a second without anyone to blame. Beerus wasn't erasing humanity. He was erasing its excuses. "This," Beerus said calmly, "is judgment." Wise nodded. "You're narrowing the field." "I am removing outcomes," Beerus corrected. "Only choices remain." In a fortified bunker beneath what used to be a major European capital, a final coalition tried to act. Not to attack, not to study, to plead. Emergency communication arrays powered up, bypassing everything that had failed before, channeling a message directly into the space Beerus occupied. A single voice spoke, shaking but resolute. "If we are found wanting," it said, "then tell us how to be sufficient." Beerus closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he opened them again, the planet felt heavier. "Sufficiency," Beerus said, "is not obedience." He gestured, and the communication array disintegrated, not erased but reduced to inert matter that would never function again. "You have mistaken survival for entitlement," he continued, voice carrying across the world without sound. "You ask for rules so you can exploit them. You ask for standards so you can meet them minimally." People heard him anyway. In their bones, in the pressure behind their eyes, in the sudden understanding that this wasn't a speech. It was a verdict. Homelander felt it from a rehabilitation facility that no longer knew what to do with him. He sat alone in a room without mirrors, hands shaking, senses dulled permanently. The voice didn't accuse him directly. It didn't need to. Homelander screamed, not in defiance but in realization. He had never mattered to judgment. He'd just been tolerated until something truer arrived. Beerus' gaze passed over him without pause. "The symbol is resolved," Beerus said to Wise. "Now the system." The escalation peaked. Beerus raised his hand fully this time, palm open toward the planet. Energy didn't gather. There was no glow, no aura, just a subtle distortion like reality itself bracing. "Listen carefully," Beerus said, voice now utterly flat. "This is the only appeal." He closed his fist. Across Earth, every soup felt it instantly. Not pain. Limitation. Powers flickered, shrank, redefined themselves. Invulnerability became resistance. Strength became conditional. Regeneration slowed, then normalized. Not removed, balanced. The world didn't lose its anomalies. It lost its gods. Subs collapsed in confusion and terror as the ceiling dropped around them. Some screamed. Some cried. Some tried to fly and fell. It wasn't punishment for sin. It was correction for imbalance. The boys felt it too, though they weren't sups. The air changed. The tension eased. Something oppressive lifted, replaced by a dangerous quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. "What did he do?" Huey whispered. Butcher stared at the skyline, eyes wide. "He made it fair," he said, "or as close as it gets." Beerus lowered his hand. "The experiment continues," he said, "on probation." Wise smiled faintly. "You didn't destroy them." Beerus snorted. "Destruction teaches nothing if the subject is gone." He turned away from Earth slightly, posture relaxing for the first time since his arrival. They will struggle now. They will fail. They will rebuild systems that break again, but they will do it without pretending they are untouchable. Below, chaos erupted, not violent but existential. Institutions scrambled to redefine themselves. Sups panicked as their identities collapsed overnight. Markets reeled. Faith fractured and reformed into smaller, quieter shapes. The world didn't end. It cracked. And cracks, unlike ash, could spread. Beerus glanced back one last time, eyes narrowing as he focused on the planet's collective reaction. Not gratitude, not hatred. Determination. A dangerous one. He said, "They might actually survive this." Wise tilted his head, "And if they do?" Beerus' tail flicked lazily, "Then the verdict stands." As they drifted away, the sky over Earth brightened just slightly, like the edge of a storm breaking without warning. The judgment was complete. What came next would not be guided. It would be earned. The world didn't collapse after Beerus' judgment. That surprised everyone. There were no mass extinctions, no cities erased overnight, no final screams echoing through space. Instead, Earth entered a phase far more uncomfortable than annihilation. It had to live with what had been taken away and what had been left behind. Sups woke up weak. Not powerless, never that clean, but diminished. Strength that once shattered concrete now strained joints. Flight became exhausting. Regeneration slowed enough for scars to matter. The illusion of invincibility cracked everywhere at once, and with it went the behaviors built on that illusion. Hospitals overflowed. Not from civilians this time, but from sups who had never learned how to bleed responsibly. Panic set in as medical systems struggled to adapt to patients whose physiology no longer justified special treatment, but still didn't obey human rules. Doctors stopped asking who someone used to be. They asked what still worked. Vaught's remnants tried to intervene. What was left of the corporation attempted emergency buyouts, information lockdowns, and quiet extraction of compromised assets. Every attempt failed, not because Beerus intervened again, but because the world no longer accepted Vaught's authority. Without God-tier leverage, their contracts were just paper. Governments seized what they could. Facilities were nationalized. Compound V research was locked down under international oversight. Superhero branding was quietly dismantled, logos removed from uniforms, statues pulled down not in riots but in scheduled dismantlings that felt almost ceremonial. The age of spectacle was over. The boys watched it happen from the margins, no longer necessary but still unable to disengage. "This is what we wanted," Huey said, not convinced. Butcher didn't respond. He'd seen enough wars to know the aftermath always looked like this, messy, directionless, filled with people pretending they understood the cost. Across the world, sups reacted in different ways. Some disappeared, retreating into anonymity, terrified of a world where they were no longer special. Others lashed out, committing crimes in desperation, only to be stopped by law enforcement that finally had a fighting chance. A few tried to help. Not as icons. As people. That frightened the public more than the villains ever had. Homelander didn't leave his facility. He couldn't. His body had stabilized, but his mind hadn't. Stripped of his powers, stripped of worship, stripped of the narrative that had defined him. He existed in a state of permanent unraveling. Doctors noted catatonic episodes punctuated by violent emotional outbursts. There was no rehabilitation plan. No one knew what to do with a god who had become a liability. Beerus observed all of it from a distance. He hadn't left the universe. He'd simply withdrawn his attention, watching from a place where time passed differently. He didn't interfere as systems collapsed and reformed. He didn't correct mistakes. This was the point. This phase determines everything, Wise said, standing beside him. They can't blame you anymore. Beerus nodded. Now they show me what they are without excuses. The escalation didn't come from the sky. It came from humanity. Protests erupted, not against Beerus, but against the idea of unchecked power. New movements formed demanding transparency, accountability, and limitations not just for SUPs, but for institutions that had relied on them. Courts reopened cases long buried under PR settlements. Truth became dangerous. Several former members of the Seven were arrested quietly, others fled. None were protected. The world didn't forgive. It recalculated. In one city, a former mid-tier sup attempted to seize control of a district, believing fear would still work. He was stopped by a coalition of civilians and police, injured badly enough to matter, and taken into custody without ceremony. The footage went viral. Not because it was shocking, because it was possible. Butcher watched that clip on repeat, something tight in his chest slowly loosening. That, he said quietly, that's new. Beerus felt the shift then. Not relief. Momentum. Humanity wasn't stabilizing. It was adapting. That intrigued him. But not all consequences were survivable. In regions where SUPs had propped up fragile regimes, power vacuums turned violent. Militias rose. Old grudges resurfaced. Without a god to fear, humans turned on each other the way they always had. Beerus didn't intervene. He watched. Do you regret it? Wise asked softly. Beerus considered the question, longer than usual. No, he said finally, but this is the cost. The final escalation began not with an attack, but with a decision. From dozens of world capitals, a unified declaration was drafted, not addressed to Beerus, but to each other. A binding international framework that outlawed god-tier concentration of power, enforced oversight on enhanced individuals, and accepted that no external force would save them again. It wasn't perfect. It was human. Beerus read it. Then he smiled. That, he said, is acceptable. He turned away from Earth at last, posture relaxing fully. They will suffer, he said. They will fail again, but they will do it honestly. Wise nodded, and if they forget. Beerus' expression hardened just slightly. Then I will remember. The sky over Earth cleared completely for the first time since Beerus' arrival. Not because he allowed it, because he no longer needed to watch so closely. The gods were gone. The consequences remained. The world did not celebrate when Beerus finally turned away. There were no global announcements, no monuments erected to survival, no speeches declaring victory over the impossible. Humanity had learned, painfully and decisively, that survival was not the same as triumph. The absence of gods did not feel like freedom. It felt like responsibility settling onto shoulders that had never been prepared to carry it. Cities rebuilt slowly. Not higher, not louder. Smaller systems replaced grand designs. Emergency infrastructure was prioritized over spectacle. Hero branding vanished entirely, replaced by functional designations that described what someone did, not what they were meant to represent. The word soup faded out of common language, replaced by clinical terms that stripped away myth. Power became suspicious by default. The boys disbanded without ceremony. There was no final mission, no dramatic farewell. They simply stopped meeting. Huey took a job with a civilian oversight committee, pushing paperwork instead of explosives, exhausted but alive. Mother's Milk returned to his family, wary of a world that finally resembled something close to normal. Frenchie and Kimiko disappeared into anonymity, choosing distance over redemption. Butcher stayed behind the longest. He walked through cities that no longer needed him, watching people argue about zoning laws instead of gods. He should have felt satisfied. He didn't. Victory had never been his goal. Ending the lie was, and the lie was gone. That left a hollow space where purpose used to be. Homelander survived. That fact would haunt the world longer than his fall ever could. He was transferred to a black site medical facility under international supervision, not as a prisoner of war or a criminal, but as a liability no system had prepared for. His powers never returned. Whatever Beerus had taken, he had taken cleanly. Homelander aged now. Slowly, painfully. Every year etched lines into his face that cameras would never capture again. He was lucid enough to understand what he'd lost and broken enough to know it would never come back. Sometimes he demanded to speak to crowds that didn't exist. Other times he sat silently, staring at walls as if waiting for applause that would never arrive. The world did not forgive him. It didn't need to. He became a footnote in history books rewritten without reverence. Up above, far beyond human instruments, Beerus watched one final time. Earth had stabilized into something rough but functional. Not good, not just, but honest in its limits. Sups no longer shaped geopolitics. Corporations no longer hid behind capes. Humanity argued, fought, compromised, and failed the way it always had, without pretending it was being protected. Wise stood beside Beerus, staff resting lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't destroy them," Wise said. "Many expected you would." Beerus snorted softly. "Destruction is easy, replacement is boring." He observed the planet in silence for a long moment, eyes tracing patterns of movement, adaptation, and quiet resilience. "They learned," Beerus continued, "not what they wanted, what they needed." Wise smiled faintly. "And if they forget?" Beerus' gaze hardened just a fraction. "Then the verdict does not change," he said, "only the enforcement." With that, Beerus turned away. Not dramatically, not in a burst of light or cosmic spectacle. He simply left, attention shifting elsewhere, judgment complete. The universe resumed its normal rhythms without noticing anything had been decided. On Earth, no one felt the moment he was truly gone. They only felt the absence later, when fear no longer had a shape to blame and responsibility had nowhere left to hide. The age of gods ended without ceremony. What followed was human. Messy, fragile, dangerous. And finally, honest. The verdict remained. Not in the sky, but in what the world chose to become without being watched.